Shabbat Shalom. So I'd like to take everyone back to the heady, wild, lawless, liberal days of the 16th century. Back in the 16th century, we are having a renaissance in Judaism as well as much of the rest of the world. And our poetry flows as it has not done so since the time of King David. Many of the songs and the poems that we know now as part of our regular service were penned during that time. So I'd like to take everyone back to that moment by asking you to turn to page 10 in your Siddur, not the Chumash. That's the one that says Lev Shalem on the cover. It's the smaller of the red books, unless you're using the big print version, in which case it is the giant book. All right, page 10. Everybody found the page, and I'm sorry for having to do the textual reference, but this is not going to be clear unless you're actually looking at some words. For those of you that are more comfortable in the English, great, the translation is on the left-hand side, but I'm going to have to warn you, English is not a great language. And I can say that, not only because I'm a native speaker, but because I had to teach it to foreigners for 3 years, and it's a pretty messed up language. But it also is an inadequate language in some ways. This poem, Yedid Nefesh, creatively titled, because that's the first two words, this is a love song to God. And God is characterized throughout in the most passionate, most intimate, and the most loving of manners. You'll notice that indeed, right after Yedid Nefesh, the opening lines, beloved of my soul, we have the phrase Av Harachama. And anybody want to give me the translation of those words? I'll give you a hint, they're translated in the English too. Compassionate Father, compassionate Father. So throughout this poem, we would expect then that the author would approach God as Father, correct? Makes perfect sense. It's right there at the beginning, even though true, the term Yedid is often used more in a loving sense, and that might be a little awkward. We mentioned Father, and now we're fine. And if you are reading along in the translation, you would get nothing to disabuse you of that idea. However, if you are reading along in the Ivrit, in the Hebrew, there are verbs and adjectives and pronouns. And unlike English, all of those have a gender inflection. That means that when you are talking to a man, you would use, for example, a suffix that would be a echa, as we've used in many places, whereas when we are talking to a woman, it would be a ach. So it's not shelcha or shelach, would be yours and his. Yours when speaking to a man, and then yours when speaking to a woman. We don't do that in English, right? If I say you, it means male or female, whereas in Hebrew I have two separate words for that, at and ata, female and male. We also have plural versions too, but let's stick with this for a moment. For those of you that are a little bit more conversant in Hebrew, what is the gender for God throughout the rest of this song? Female. Female. God is referred to as both male and female within one poem. As a matter of fact, the female side dominates the poem, apart from that Av reference, that compassionate father near the beginning. And we didn't know this until quite recently. Let me give you the story of Yedid Nefesh. It's written in the 1500s, like I mentioned, quickly becomes a sensation, but many people are apparently uncomfortable with the femininization of God. And so they changed it. They went through and flipped all of those conjugations, all of those inflection markers, and turned it into masculine forms throughout the entire poem. And then they forgot that they had done so. Because this is back in the day. I mean, how are you going to know what the author originally wanted it to sound like once someone has scrubbed it clean from the offending feminization of God? Well, I'll tell you how you know what the author actually intended. You look at the author's own handwriting. Somebody was doing archival work at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, the flagship library for the conservative movement, home of many of the rarest books and collections of Jewish writings in the world today. And they came across the author's original draft of this poem. And they went, wait a minute. That doesn't say he, that doesn't say you masculine, that says you feminine throughout the entire thing. Now, you've got two options when you discover something like this. One option is to say, this is amazing, and leave it just like that, or publish it in an academic journal, but leave it as merely an object of curiosity, but to not change a word on page 10. The other option is to say, well, if that's what the original author said, and it works very well, and in fact, that makes a lot more sense than many of the versions that we currently have, let's reprint this from now on, rather than the scrubbed versions that we have gotten in our prayer books currently. We'll just tear out the current version, and we'll go back to this original draft by the original author. Guess which one the conservative movement did? Well, you're holding the results in your hand. Page 10 is now as the author intended. Page 10 has been restored to its original ambiguous form, where God is referred to as both a man in the first couple words, and then in feminine poetic imagery throughout in quite passionate detail. And we can talk about more of that when I'm not talking to a full group with mixed age ranges. But we can come back to some of the imagery that they were even reluctant to put into the translation if you'd like to talk to me during the Kiddush. The conservative movement made the change back to the original. So what is the more traditional form, then, of this song? Is the traditional form the song that was used for a few hundred years, the edited, expurgated version, or is the more traditional form of the song that the author originally wrote, that we are now have in our Siddur? See, that's what happens when you use the word traditional as though in and of itself it is a value statement. It is unfortunate that many times we will take what is being done as the best thing to be done. That because it is, quote, traditional, what we have already done, therefore it has a standing that is higher than any other alternatives. Now, the conservative movement is not exactly keen to change things. We've got a reputation for being slow on a lot of matters, and this took many, many years of debate and discussion before page 10 was finally edited. And by the way, you can close your Siddurs if you want. I'm not going to ask you to make any more references to it. But we do recognize that sometimes the correct version is not the version we have been doing. That the tradition does not speak in an infallible way. That sometimes our tradition, that is to say, the pattern with which we act our Judaism, has been led astray. Sometimes it's because manuscripts have been edited and changed, and we are left with a mistaken understanding of something that, were we to have the original, never would have happened in the first place. Sometimes it happens because when decisions were being made, they were often being made with incomplete information about the world around us. For example, I am currently using a microphone. I am using electricity on Shabbat. There was a time back in the dawn of the 20th century when electricity was becoming more common, when this was debated, and Orthodox, conservative alike, all Jews said, no electricity on Shabbat. Why? Because it's fire. Fire? Well, I'm afraid that there was rather inadequate science education about electricity. I'm sure our elementary school students now can tell me electricity is not fire. But back then, they compared it to gas lights. You have tubes that go from the giant gas tanks downtown that will lead into your home, and then you light the fire, and electricity is just the same, Rabbi, says the people in town who think they know what it is about. And the only difference is the fire is kept in the big tank downtown, and it's then being sent out through wires rather than tubes. Well, with that understanding of electricity, then yes, of course it's forbidden by Jewish law. You can't use fire on Shabbat. Sorry to my smokers. And so, of course, you're not going to have electricity. But then someone sat down and said, well, wait a minute, hold on. Is that really what electricity is? Does it fit the definition of fire either by physics or, more importantly, by Jewish standards? And the answer is no. That electricity does not fit the definition of fire by Jewish standards, and in fact, it doesn't fit the definition of any forbidden category of work. And therefore, while you cannot use electricity to perform forbidden work, no electric hair clippers, for example, they're no better on Shabbat than manual ones, you can use electricity for things that do not violate Shabbat, such as speaking into a microphone, or even switching on simple lighting like we have here. We updated how we practice Judaism because we had new information. Sometimes that information comes, like I said, from lost manuscripts and texts that give us new illumination and insights. Sometimes that change comes because we have done further research into the physical world, and sometimes, as in the case of the conservative movement allowing and approving same-sex relationships, because of an investigation into human beings themselves. This does not make it wrong. This does not make it radical. This means we are actually continuing the work of Judaism. Because Torah was not given to us simply to memorize and then never update our application. Torah was given so that no matter the encounter, no matter the situation we would be in, we would be able to constantly use Torah to help elucidate it without hiding from the facts of reality, without hiding from the fact that we might have misunderstood something in the world in the past, and without shame say, you know what, our ancestors did the best they could with the facts, the figures, the data, the science, and the texts that they had, but thank God we have been blessed with a progress in many of those fields. And, while it hasn't changed everything, some things it changes fairly significant. You know, I can have swordfish. That's another one of those famous misunderstandings in the early days of encountering the fish, and many people thought it was not kosher, when in fact, by Jewish law, it absolutely is, and yet there are still people who refuse to eat it. Because how dare we change? Likewise, I can have techelet, the dyed blue threads on my talit, which comes from a very particular snail, even though that particular snail's method of extraction was lost for about 1,500 years. It was rediscovered in the 20th century, and now we can produce it with confidence and know that we are indeed complying with halakha. That is the strength of the attitude that holds within the conservative movement. When we say conservative, we don't mean we're just conservationists, as though we were working in a museum with something behind glass, frozen in time, petrified to be looked at, to be, quote, observed, but not to actually be lived or used. No, we are conservationists of beautiful, old, vintage vehicle. And we're going to keep it running. And we're going to continue to use techniques that allow it to remain true to what it is, but also can continue to function on the roads, rather than simply parking it in place and pretending as though it had never changed in the past, never continued to adapt. And this is essential, because if we allow ourselves to be pigeonholed, either to say constantly no to every change or to say yes to every change, then we stand for nothing. We have now decided the ideal is not Torah, the ideal is not to live as God has asked us to live. The ideal is to live as our community has set as a predefined answer to any and all questions. Yes or no. The conservative movement is famous for liking to say yes and no. And that is always the healthiest approach to take. And it is with some satisfaction that I can see our modern world is in need of this attitude even more than at any point in our past, with too many willing to judge the world solely by their preconceived notions, by their personal or community tradition, without willingness to open up and examine why they hold that belief, why they practice in that way, and whether or not it is based on perhaps a faulty text, a misreading, or a misunderstanding of the science and the world around us. This is the calling of the conservative movement. There is a reason why there are more than just two movements in Judaism. The center must hold, the center must listen to all, and we have to make sure to keep doing the work that we were asked to do. It's not easy, but it is very satisfying. Shabbat Shalom.